As most of you guys know, Jonathan Hickman's Fantastic Four run is one of my favorite stories, like probably in the top 3, if not the top 2. And because Fantastic Four First Steps is coming out next year, I feel like there's a lot of people who are interested in getting into it. So in this video, I'm gonna give you guys a reading order for Hickman's Fantastic Four run, which is better than the one that Marvel has. Marvel's is trash, but I'm also gonna give you a summary of what goes on over the course of these volumes. And that's really more for the people who don't wanna read the whole thing and just kind of want the summary of what happens during his run. So Jonathan Hickman's Fantastic Four run kicks off with the Dark Reign miniseries. It's a 5-part series and it's literally called Dark Reign Fantastic Four. This is technically part of Marvel's Dark Reign initiative, which we don't have to go into the details of. The long and short of it is that it's the Green Goblin, Norman Osborn, basically trying to get rid of superheroes. And the first ones he targets are the Fantastic Four because of their position within the superhero community. There's 2 main things that happen in this story that kind of set the stage for everything that comes after. The first is that it establishes Franklin Richards' ability to alter reality. Now, this had been a long-standing part of the Fantastic Four mythos, but the reality here is that when it came to Franklin Richards' powers, his ability to alter reality was kind of spotty. It was hit and miss, and in fact, it was something that hadn't been seen in Marvel for quite some time. And so because of that, it was Hickman saying, like, this story, yes, it's called Fantastic Four, yes, it will focus on the Fantastic Four, but it's more of a Franklin Richards story than anything else. And the way you see this is when Norman Osborn invades the Baxter Building and Franklin Richards shoots him with a real bullet fired from a fake gun. And that's when you find out, okay, like, this kid's altering reality, right? The second thing that happens is that Reed builds the bridge. Now, the bridge is stupendously important, not necessarily because of really the Fantastic Four run. The bridge is only relevant for the first couple volumes. After that, it doesn't really seem to matter all that much, although it does come back once you get to what I call the conclusion, more or less volume 8 of the Fantastic Four run. But the bridge is incredibly important if you decide you want to read Hickman's Avengers and New Avengers and Secret Wars. Because during Avengers and New Avengers, the bridge that Reed rebuilds is actually how he looks into the multiverse to see how other realities are handling the incursions. So again, it's important to understand it's basically development here in order to grasp what's going on with it over there. Now, when Reed first builds it here in the Dark Reign series, he just kind of like looks into other universes. And it's really just designed to say, like, here's what the bridge is capable of. The Council of Reeds is teased in the Dark Reign series, but you don't really see them in any meaningful way. They're more just silhouettes and they're like, hey, we're here if you ever need us, and like, that's it. Another big thread that isn't really official, but it is kind of important for the remainder of the story is that it establishes that Reed is kind of disassociated from his family. He's not like a horrible father. He's not abandoning his family, but it's quite clear that his mind is almost always on science as opposed to being on a family man. But that takes us into what I call volume 2. This is called Solve Everything, and this is Fantastic Four issues 570 through 574. Now, this builds into 4 main things. The first one is that it establishes Reed's abandonment issues with his father, in the sense that his father, Nathaniel, had effectively taken off on Reed when he was relatively young. Now, there is a story called S.H.I.E.L.D., written by Jonathan Hickman, which introduces something called the Brotherhood of the S.H.I.E.L.D., and that's what Nathaniel was a part of. And in fact, during Jonathan Hickman's run, he really just kind of establishes that what Nathaniel had been doing was basically traveling through the multiverse and just killing all these different versions of himself. That's not overly important when it comes to understanding Hickman's run. That's just more designed to resolve the plot threads that had been lingering for really decades in Marvel Comics regarding the character of Nathaniel, who is not King the Conqueror. The second thing that it does is it has Reed meeting the Council of Reeds for the very first time and establishing the nature of the Council. Now, the Council of Reeds is really, really cool in Marvel, but there's 2 parts to them. There's all the great things they do, then there's the horrible things that they do or have done. The great things that they do is that they travel to different realities and fix all kinds of problems that they come across. So for example, they may come across a star that's about to go supernova, and so they literally perform surgery, quote unquote, on the star and then prevent it from going supernova and saving the entire star system. There's whole universes where the Council of Reeds basically turn those realities into what are essentially giant farms, and they use the resources from those universes to feed other universes. And then there's things like, helping other universes fight off their versions of Galactus or something like that. But the darker side of the Council of Reeds is twofold. The first is that because they focus so much on what they do, they've abandoned their families. They walked away from their reality's version of Susan and Valeria and Franklin, Ben Grimm, Johnny Storm. They gave it all up. Now, one of the things this does that Hickman did is he took the idea of Reed having abandonment issues with his father, the fact that there were all these other alternate reality versions of Nathaniel who would also abandon their sons, and used that as a baseline for why it was that these members of the Council of Reeds were so easily able to abandon their families. But the other thing that the Council does is they establish that Dr. Doom's quest for power, right, his thirst for power is insatiable. So in every single reality they come across where Dr. Doom rises to power and then tries to take over that universe, they swoop in, they grab him, they lobotomize him, then they stick him below the Citadel in the Council's headquarters. And there's like dozens of Dr. Dooms who are down there because they don't all rise to power and become villains at the same time. And some never do. Some become good guys, right? So the third thing that the Solve Everything story arc does is it introduces the Mad Celestials, in the sense that in another universe, the Celestials had gone crazy and they had forced the entire universe's inhabitants to worship them as gods. Now, we don't really get much more about them besides that, so we don't really know how those Celestials contended with guys like Galactus, if Galactus even existed in that reality or potentially had already been destroyed when the Celestials made their move. We don't know how those Celestials dealt with things like Thanos and the Infinity Gauntlet. There were a lot of unanswered questions there. And I would love to see that story arc written by Marvel at some point if Jonathan Hickman ever decided to. But what ended up happening is one of the members of the Council traveled to that reality in an attempt to save it from the Celestials. When the Celestials got a hold of him, they read his mind, learned about the Council, and realized that by infiltrating the Council of Reeds, they could access the entire multiverse, and they could conquer every reality across the multiverse, expand their sphere of influence. So they invaded the Council of Reeds. And what follows is effectively a bloodbath, right? I mean, people just get massacred all over the place. And it gets to the point where Reed Richards from the main Marvel Universe barely makes it out with his life and ends up shutting the bridge down. He closes the portal to the Council of Reeds and then goes back and rejoins his family. And that kind of seems to be him becoming a regular family man. But the final part of Solve Everything is arguably one of the most important parts of Jonathan Hickman's run. And this is when Franklin Richards has his birthday. And just like an older dude shows up to the Baxter Building, having infiltrated all their security systems and just seemingly teleported in. He warns Valeria Richards, the daughter of Reed, about things like the War of the Four Cities, and it's almost kind of like a prophecy, things like that. But he also takes Franklin Richards, says something to him, and wakes his powers up. And so at the end of Solve Everything, you have that panel that most of you guys have seen where Franklin is sitting under his bed, creating an entire universe in the palm of his hands. Now, at that point, you have a kind of interlude here. And the reason why is because in order to understand Prime Elements, which is volume 3, you need to go back and read Mark Waid's Fantastic Four run. But specifically, you need to read Fantastic Four issues 554 to 559, and then Fantastic Force issues 1 through 4. We don't need to go into all the details of everything that goes on, but the long and short of what happens during Mark Waid's run is that in Fantastic Four 554 through 559, that you end up learning that at some point in the future, Earth is going to become uninhabitable. And so a guy named Ted Castle had basically created a perfect replica of Earth. And the idea was that only the wealthy were going to be able to live there. Of course, his wife figured out what was going on. She told the Fantastic Four, and a little bit of chaos ensued. Fantastic Force is the follow-up to that. And it's what makes it all make sense. That what ends up happening is that there's a group called the New Defenders, who essentially come from the future of the Old Man Logan universe, the one where Wolverine was tricked into killing the X-Men and so on and so forth. The New Defenders overpowered and destroyed Galactus in that future. And because Earth was basically dying, but there were still 6 billion people there, what they intended to do was use the dead body of Galactus by gathering various energy sources that exist around the Earth in the present day, and then power that Galactus body and bring those 6 billion people to Earth in the present. The problem is you'd have 12 billion people at the time the comic was written or something along those lines. Earth would be wildly overpopulated instantly, right? Just not enough resources. And so what Reed Richards did is he actually ended up taking those 6 billion people and teleporting them to New World. And New World just existed out there. After that, Reed Richards took the body of Galactus from the future and buried it in Earth and left it that way. Now, I want you to keep that little bit about Galactus being buried in the back of your head, because that's going to become important later on down the line when we end up getting to volume 5 and the 3 story arc, because that becomes becomes resoundingly important. But following Mark Waid's run, right, if you go back and you read that, you go into volume 3, Prime Elements. Now this is Fantastic Four issues 575 to 578. There are some things that go on here, but the reality is that Prime Elements is only really important because it introduces or brings back 4 different things. The first is the Universal Inhumans, the second is the Forever City, the third is what's called the Peak, which is part of Old Atlantis, and the fourth is the blue area of the moon. We're not going to go super in-depth into that right now because we're going to circle back around to that here in a little bit once we get to like volume 7, and all that's going to make sense in terms of why those 4 places were here. Understand, there is a whole story behind each one of these. There's a whole story behind the Universal Inhumans, a story behind the Forever City, behind Old Atlantis, and the blue area of the moon. But going in-depth into that, I feel like would just make the video too dense and would kind of lead us too far off track. So just to keep it simple, we'll circle back around to it later. After that, you go into volume 4, which is called the Future Foundation. That's Fantastic Four issues 579 through 582. As you can imagine, that's when we're introduced to the Future Foundation in Marvel Comics. Now, the Future Foundation is really, really cool. And the reason why was because what Reed Richards had been doing up to that point is he had been funding a lot of these think tanks. But what he realized was that a lot of the adults that were part of these think tanks were effectively squandering things. They weren't really developing anything meaningful or incredibly fantastic that could fall in line with Reed Richards' view of solving the problem of everything or going into uncharted territory of like invention and development. What Reed realized is that the only real source of imagination that exists out there is kids. And so Reed Richards quit basically funding all these think tanks, and then he launched the Future Foundation. And the Future Foundation, while you do have the Fantastic Four who are part of it, it also is composed of like Valeria and Franklin and other kids that exist within the Marvel Universe that are incredible geniuses or in some capacity closely tied to the Fantastic Four. It does have its own plot thread, but again, we're keeping things relatively simple here. What this also does is it resolves the plot thread of Reed Richards' father. Again, going into the idea of Reed's father being part of the Brotherhood of the Shield, the fact that he, alongside every other version of himself across the multiverse, had gained the ability to time travel. And so because Immortus, right, that alternate reality version of Kang in the future, realized that giving individuals, or with individuals having kind of the ability to time travel, but none of the knowledge or responsibility on how to implement it effectively, could potentially lay waste to all of reality. And so Immortus forced all of these versions of Nathaniel to kill each other. And it was called the Great Hunt, right? Again, it's not overly important, but it is kind of cool, right? It is interesting here. And that's when you go into the final part of this, which is you end up learning who the Future Man was from all the way back in volume 2, Solve Everything, which is actually Franklin Richards from the future. And for reasons that were not immediately explained, Franklin and future Valeria were working alongside Nathaniel Richards. And what Nathaniel Richards had done is he had actually jumped to the present day. And that kind of kicked off the story of everything going on with, like, you know, the Great Hunt and so on and so forth. But Franklin and Valeria are literally just kind of standing there waiting for something to happen, waiting for a moment to occur, at which point they can make their move. So again, Hickman doesn't give us a whole lot of information to go on in that particular moment, but they do come back and everything gets explained, and it is incredible. So at that point, we go into volume 5, and that is the 3-story arc. Now, the 3-story arc is the most dense of all the story arcs that Hickman does, but it's also the best, because the first thing this does is it establishes that Reed's daughter Valeria in the present day had discovered the remnants of the Council of Reeds, and there were a few survivors, and she brought them back to Earth. The second thing that happens is the Silver Surfer discovers the body of Galactus that had been buried from the New World story arc, and then he goes and tells Galactus in the present day. So Galactus comes to Earth and he grabs Reed and he's like, come with me. And so he's like, where is New World? And Reed just shows him, right? Reed's like, it's over there, right? It's this really, really cool moment, and the way that Hickman writes Galactus is fantastic, because Galactus, for a lot of years in Marvel, had almost kind of been a jobber, where he just like shows up, gets smacked around a little bit, whatever. The way that Hickman does it, Galactus just like exudes this air of authority. Like when he shows up on Earth, Reed realizes why he's here, right? Because Silver Surfer tells him, there's a corpse of Galactus in your Earth, but Galactus is alive here. You need to explain to him what's going on. And so when Galactus appears, he's just like, explain. And like, that's it. And Reed immediately goes into an explanation. It's this great depiction of the authority Galactus has. But what ends up happening is Galactus forces Reed to take him to New World so he can see what all happened that led to him dying in the future and whether or not it was worth it and so on and so forth. Ultimately, Galactus consumes New World, right? He destroys that entire planet. But in the process and during this time, he reveals to Reed Richards that Franklin's powers are reactivated. And then he literally tells him, we left Earth as fast as we did because I didn't want to get into a fight with Franklin. Galactus was afraid of Franklin Richards and what he was capable of. It's one of the coolest moments in Hickman's run. The way it's depicted is absolutely fantastic. The next thing this does is it establishes that the annihilation wave is on Earth. Now, this may catch some of you guys out of left field. Not everybody is familiar with the annihilation wave. The annihilation wave is led by a villain named Annihilus, and they exist in the negative zone. Literally just a whole other universe over there somewhere. We don't have to go into the ins and outs of it, but basically Annihilus is quite literally what he sounds like, a nihilist. And so he believes life is meaningless. There was a story written in 2006, 2007 by Dan Abnett called Annihilation, which actually saw Annihilus invading the main Marvel universe while the events of Civil War were happening on Earth and almost wiped out all life across the universe. They captured Galactus, overpowered the Silver Surfer. It was phenomenal, right? Ultimately, once Galactus was freed, he laid waste to the annihilation wave, and well, the rest was just kind of easy pickings for the rest of the superheroes to take care of. But what ended up happening is there was a kind of cult that developed that was obsessed with Annihilus. And in fact, I think it was one of Annihilus's forces that had stayed on Earth, or at least arrived on Earth, and cultivated this cult and kind of built them into what they were. The intention was to break into the Baxter Building and then to open the portal in the Baxter Building that directly accesses the negative zone so Annihilus's forces could invade Earth. That's when you get into the death of Johnny Storm. Because what ends up happening is Johnny, who for a lot of the run on the Fantastic Four was constantly being chastised by Reed for being too silly, not being serious enough, not really deciding where he stands or what things mean to him, and just kind of living life all just sort of, whatever, willy-nilly. There's this really awesome moment where like he tells Ben Grimm as like they're getting the kids out, right, out of like the negative zone and all that kind of stuff. It's like, tell Reed this is where I made my stand. Because what Johnny does is while he's given instructions to like basically shut down the portal from the other side, he shuts it with himself trapped on the other side. And so you get like this incredible moment in the story when Johnny Storm, after the doors close and everything, where he's just like 1 against 1 billion, right? And he's just like, flame on! And then like the comic ends and it's incredible. It's like, it was this insane cliffhanger when it happened, but like it was the death of Johnny. Now, a comic that's not necessary, but is a great read is Fantastic Four 588. Technically, Johnny Storm dies in 587, but 588 is a comic that has no words. No one says anything in that entire comic until you get to the very end. Instead, it's all something like 30 days of mourning. So there's a point where like Ben Grimm is mourning the death of Johnny. So like Donald Blake shows up and Bruce Banner shows up and they try to console him and he's like, I don't want to hear any of it. So Donald Blake calls down the thunder, turns himself into Thor. Bruce Banner turns into the Hulk, and they all just duke it out in the desert so that Ben Grimm can just fight out all his frustration, and like they're crying at the end of it. It's amazing. It's this incredible comic. It's probably the greatest single Fantastic Four comic that I think has ever been written in the history of Marvel. But that's when you go into essentially volume 6. Now this is where Fantastic Four gets renamed to FF. And so you're going to read issues 1 through 5. Now, while this does temporarily kind of adjust the title to FF, what you end up getting is Spider-Man who joins the Future Foundation and quote unquote replaces Johnny Storm. I use that phrase very sparingly, but this builds on the events of Valeria discovering the remnants of the Council and inviting the survivors from the Council of Reeds to Earth. Because what she does is she meets with Reed after having met with Dr. Doom and tells him like, these guys are traveling across the world and what they're trying to do is they're basically hunting down these various artifacts and then trying to use their source of power to build something called Saul's Anvil. Now that's where you go into the Universal Inhumans, the Forever City, Old Atlantis, and the Blue Area of the Moon. The Universal Inhumans and the Blue Area of the Moon kind of go hand in hand in the sense that the Blue Area of the Moon is a section of the moon that has oxygen, yet the Watcher does live there, but like average people can go there if you manage to find a way to get there, and you can just walk around and breathe and be just fine. But the Universal Inhumans was part of the War of the Four Cities. We don't necessarily have to go into it, but the Universal Inhumans was kind of a prophecy that was given to Valeria by adult Franklin Richards. What matters is that, as most of you guys know, the Inhumans were created by the Kree on Earth, and they were just kind of a military campaign in terms of like espionage and subterfuge. The whole basis behind the Inhumans was that they were beings that were given a kind of gene within their own system, so that when they were exposed to the Terrigen Mist, they would mutate into whatever their gene required them to mutate into. So say, for example, that there was like just some alien race that existed out there, and they had a Inhuman gene that would make them look human. Then their job would be to come to Earth and start sowing discord and creating chaos. The idea being that by doing that, there would be so much focus in what's happening on Earth, nobody would pay attention to what's happening out there, right? Civil war, strife, the whole nine yards. What's happening out there is a Kree invasion fleet heading to Earth. And because Earth would be so broken on a societal level, it would be easy to conquer. And so imagine that, but with all kinds of races all across the universe. And that was the whole point behind the Inhumans project as far as the Kree were concerned. There was a prophecy from the Kree race that was made by the Supreme Intelligence that eventually a member of the Inhuman tribe would actually destroy the Kree in their entirety. They would rise up and lead to their oblivion, which technically happened in the prelude to War of Kings in Marvel. And so the instruction was given by the Supreme Intelligence to wipe out all the Inhumans across the universe. Only 4 groups survived. The 3 groups that ended up showing up on Earth, and then the ones that were already here. Black Bolt, the Inhumans, and all those guys. What the Universal Inhumans ended up doing alongside the Inhumans of Earth is they took up residence on the blue area of the moon and stayed there during Hickman's Fantastic Four run. But there was a kind of source of power under the blue area that one of the members of the Council of Reeds was hunting for. And that's what the surviving members were doing. They were going to the Forever City of the High Evolutionary. They were going to the Peak, this kind of crystalline structure in Old Atlantis. They were trying to harness the power of those things to build Saul's Anvil. The reason being because in one of the alternate realities where one of those reeds came from, they built a Saul's Anvil to destroy the Beyonder. And so they believed it would work in destroying the Mad Celestials, who inevitably would arrive in this reality, figuring out where those different reeds had effectively taken off to. And so what you do from there is you go into Volume 7. Now, Volume 7 is basically Reed Richards and Dr. Doom working together because Doom's been brought into the Future Foundation, and the two of them uniting the Fantastic Four alongside the Avengers and pretty much most of Earth's superheroes to repel the Kree invasion, because the Kree realized that there are still Inhuman tribes that exist out there. They just kind of have to eradicate what's left, right? The mission's not complete, for lack of a better word. And so with all these guys banding together, they end up working to annihilate, or at least to fight off, the Kree force. During this time, Jonathan Hickman actually kind of resolves the plot threads of the surviving members of the Council of Reeds, in the sense that because the Supreme Intelligence of the Kree race, its leader more or less, had already been killed, some time ago in Marvel, at the time the story was written, 2 of them were merged together to create a new Supreme Intelligence. So 2 out of the last 3 Reeds are gone. And then I think one of them was destroyed or something along those lines. I can't quite remember what happened to him. But what matters is that by the time you get to the end of Volume 7, that what you end up having is just this gigantic battle that takes place on Earth between the forces of the Kree race and the superheroes on Earth. Of course, what ended up happening is prior to that, Reed Richards was given a device by Galactus, because seemingly Galactus had figured out the Mad Celestials were already in the universe. They just hadn't arrived to Earth yet. And so he's like, when the time comes, you will know when to use this, use it, and it will call me. Reed Richards thought that that device was supposed to be used during the invasion of the Kree. So when he calls Galactus, Galactus is like, this is not why I gave you that device. I consumed several star systems in preparation for why I was going to be here. Of course, he obliterates pretty much most of the Kree armada, and the surviving ones just flee. They're like, let's just get out of here, man. We don't want to fight Galactus. But that's when the Mad Celestials show up. And that's when you go into Volume 8, if you want to call it that, or just kind of like the conclusion of Jonathan Hickman's run. Now, Volume 8 is kind of back and forth in the sense that the Fantastic Four title comes back, but you switch back and forth and alternate between Fantastic Four and FF. So technically, it goes from Fantastic Four issues 600 to 604, and then FF issues number 12 to 16. Now, FF 605 is technically the conclusion, and that's when you get that kind of meeting between Galactus and Franklin. But what ends up happening here, and what's most important, is that between issues 600 and 603, that it is an attempt by Reed Richards to use Saul's anvil to destroy the Mad Celestials. Because what ends up happening is when the Mad Celestials arrive and Galactus confronts them, that I believe he manages to destroy one of them, and so the other three merge into one celestial being and kill Galactus. And so by the time you get to issue number 604, that Reed fires Saul's anvil, his father has basically shown up after kind of jumping through the time stream and just sort of tells him, like, you only ever get one shot, right? Just no matter what happens, like, I've seen this play out multiple times, right? Like, I've been back and forth through time, and every time I try to find some way to stop this, there's nothing I can do to prevent it from happening, right? You can't save yourself. You always get destroyed by the Mad Celestials. And so Reed gets one shot off. It basically destroys the kind of composite Mad Celestial, and they split back into three again, and they start launching an attack against the Fantastic Four. Enter Franklin Richards. Because what you end up learning in the FF comics, issues 12, 13, and 14, is that while Franklin Richards as a kid was walking around in the modern day doing whatever it was that he was doing, in secret, he was being trained by his future self on how to use his powers after his powers had been woken up in Volume 2, Solve Everything. And so Franklin, as a little kid, now has total control over his abilities. But what his older self told him is, wait, do not use your powers unless you absolutely have to. It's why Franklin didn't use his powers when they were trying to fight off the forces of Annihilus during the events of the 3 story arc when Johnny Storm died. It's why Franklin never really saved the day as often as he could have, because he wasn't supposed to. And so in this moment, when like the Fantastic Four are about to die, right? They're about to be obliterated, Franklin and Valeria come from the future into the present day. And Franklin Richards whisks the Mad Celestials away with a wave of his hand. Now he just sends them to like a local system, right? They'll be back. He doesn't really destroy them, but he takes the power of his younger self and then he uses it to resurrect Galactus from the dead and turn Galactus into his herald. That's where you get like that iconic moment, right, from the Fantastic Four or from Hickman, where he's like, to me, my Galactus, right? It's one of the most amazing moments in all of the Fantastic Four. But he basically resurrects Galactus, and between the two of them, they destroy the Mad Celestials and the day saved. Now, there is a lot of meta commentary that goes on there, where Nathaniel basically reveals to Reed Richards that in every other reality, when he encountered the Mad Celestials, he was killed in this instance because he abandoned his family and went to the Council of Reeds or something along those lines. But in this reality, Reed chose his family over everything else. And so because he tried to be a father to Franklin, Franklin didn't want to see his father die because he loved him, he cared about him, he was not estranged from him. And so Franklin had effectively jumped from the future to the past to save his dad's life. Now again, there's a lot more to it than this. We're kind of going over the broad strokes here. But in essence, Hickman's run, I would say, unofficially ends when you get to 605. And I think it's 605, that's a meeting between Galactus and Franklin from the future, where Galactus tells him, like, I had no idea that you were this powerful. I knew you were powerful, I just didn't know how powerful you were. And Galactus tells him, like, when this universe ends, we'll be the last two beings here, and we will merge into a singular entity and be reborn into the next universe in whatever form that takes. Ever since that moment in Jonathan Hickman's Fantastic Four, that's been the idea behind Franklin in Marvel. You even see it now with Ryan North's run, right? It's still a mainstay of Franklin and Galactus's connection in Marvel. But after this, you kind of get a few ancillary stories over the course of Future Foundation and Fantastic Four, where Hickman just kind of wraps up plot threads, right? So for example, during Doom War, when T'Challa was injured and he passed the mantle of Black Panther to his sister Shuri, that in the Fantastic Four run by Hickman, that Black Panther is given the position of the King of the Dead by the Panther goddess Bast, which becomes important when you get to Secret Wars, and Black Panther ends up seizing control of the Marvel zombies and turns them into an army, right? That kind of thing. So it's more or less just wrapping up plot threads and little things like that. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this to an end. Again, it's fairly dense, but if you just kind of want to know what happens and you don't really want to read the comics per se, I don't know if I advise that. We do have a video series on it, but I would highly suggest you guys read it. Hickman's Fantastic Four run is incredible. And again, the reading order will be down in the description. So thank you all for watching. Let me know if you want to see more videos like this, and I will catch you all later. Peace.